some comparisons are forced. And admittedly, we spend a lot of time joking that games are basically Mage Knight. But when I say that Stars of Akarios is Gloomhaven in space, I really mean it. The extent to which this game clearly seeks to ape Gloomhaven, without attribution, not very cool, is extensive.
It's true. It will replace your deck of cards with some dice, but the main similarity is your bonus deck, 100%.
And to be fair, it's a great mechanic to rip off, right? It's a great way to have lots of little granular bits of character development. It's a great way to have the game offer some degree of randomness without necessarily handicapping the players. But I think in a recurring mode, the way in which it apes Gloomhaven is done a little bit more clumsily than it should be. Like, for example, this is a very, very minor gameplay element, but I think it speaks volumes to the comparison I'm getting at. In Gloomhaven, if you were going to do a special modifier or a special effect, if you're going to mobilize an enemy, stun them, poison them, whatever, this would happen regardless of whether you hit them or not. The miss would just clear out the damage. Thematic, not even remotely. But it does lead to a certain degree of satisfaction. In Stars of Akarios, you don't have that. A miss is a complete miss, and anything you're hoping to load onto it, any additional special weapon systems or what have you would trigger in order to load on effects, they are completely wasted. And ultimately, at the end of the day, I think that this is a kind of a microcosm of a lot of the differences that make Gloomhaven the game that it is, and Stars of Akarios a potentially worthwhile experience, but by no means in the level of Gloomhaven.
Yeah, and what we're talking about is when you attack other ships, you always are going to flip a card, and it's going to modify the amount of damage you do. So it's either going to be a miss or double damage or some bonus. And then as you advance through this campaign system, you're going to be filling out this little sheet. So I was going to say it gives you something to look forward to, and I think it was a little more clear than Gloomhaven's sort of the way they did theirs. I think there's the way you have the tree and the different ways you can do things. So this is what you're doing is you're going to be able to take away all the zeros or the minus ones, and you're going to be able to add your own cards, and they're very specific to your pilot because you have sheets for just your pilot, and much like Gloomhaven, cards that are just for your pilot. And I enjoy, just like Gloomhaven, they have rolling stats, right? So you'll flip it, it'll say, oh, you've stunned them, or you get to do a turn, and then you flip another card to do even more, either more damage, or maybe you'll be lucky and you'll roll your miss.
So like any campaign game like this, you have the core gameplay and you have all the campaign elements. And I think Walker's quite right to emphasize that the sense of progression is much more tangible and granular than that in Gloomhaven. You always feel like you're getting something out of a scenario rather than, 3 more scenarios and I might level up. And that's one element in which I appreciated it. The other campaign elements, I just want to say, don't grab me at all. I find the writing to be mediocre at best. Sometimes it's actually quite bad. There were a number of typos which made just reading aloud as a narrator, they've been corrected in the errata, of course, but it just sort of stands out and undermines the overall experience. Characters show up in medias res without any degree of explanation, but you've known them for years, so there's no need to explain who they are. Alien races don't have the benefit of a description, not even any pictures. Doesn't grab me.
And we're just grunts, and we're giving command of the entire fleet. Decisions are thrown in our lap that will affect the outcome of the entire sector.
The captain sidles up and said, how would you deal with this potentially explosive diplomatic situation? And then you make your choice, and then the captain says, yeah, I would have done the same thing. That's what we're going to do. Or, in point of fact, you're just sent to go find stuff, like your fighter pilots. The sense of the suspension of disbelief has been shattered on almost every scenario as you are elevated to the level of default admiral. So utterly, what could have been an engaging background. I'm a sucker for sci-fi. Give me a decent sci-fi universe and I'm there. Any sense of character, any sense of attachment, but as little personality as there is in a game of Gloomhaven, I find there's more personality in Gloomhaven. To say nothing of games like Tainted Grail, games of Legacy of Dragonholt. A lot of other campaign systems have come and gone, and many of them have felt incredibly dry. And Akarios is, in many ways, the darkest, bleakest of them all, much like Deep Space. And that is called an illusion!
Where this does shine, though, is in the space combat. So, because it's cooperative, they've done a great job of having an AI system for the enemies. It's not so great when they start off, but as soon as they close, then it's very interesting to sort of puzzle out where they're going to go next. You're always going to have 4 dice, even though you want more, but figuring out the puzzle of how to get behind them, or how to stay out of harm's way, or how to effectively use what you've rolled is very interesting, because there's some stress that you have to mitigate there, and other things that you sort of have to, there's ways to rest, and as you increase your stress, you're going to be putting misses into your deck, so you're constantly fighting that. And then there's planetary exploration. So anyone who has played Seventh Continent or other games like that, it's much like that. You're moving, you're putting out these cards. It'll tell you which cards to flip. But what Stars of Akarios does is it has keywords, much like Sleeping Gods and other games, which I really love that system where it's like you've done this part of the mission, you now have keyword super thruster. So whenever you meet another area of the map, it'll ask you if you have that keyword, and then you get to do another part of the story as opposed to, the nothing that's usually there.
Yeah, functionally it works fine. It's just, again, it feels like busy work. The core and meat of the game is the space combat. And indeed, your first few scenarios with space combat and Stars of Akarios, to me at least, felt revelatory. I'm like, this is a lot of the good things in Gloomhaven. It doesn't have that excellent card management system of the combo of doing top half and bottom half and of juking for initiative, but it seeks to be a simpler game, and that's fine. And the board is relatively barren, which really gives you an opportunity to set up quickly and play through a couple skirmishes in a row. Unfortunately, these skirmishes are punctuated by the bland planetary exploration, which really just seems like it's there to kill time, and the very, very simplistic, albeit appropriately so, element of deep space exploration, which is mostly just a way to hang the scenarios together. Personally, I would have excised the planetary exploration entirely and given just a sliver more content to the space exploration. I thought that would have broken up the tempo enough. And all of that having been said, though, returning back to the space combat, which really is the joy of it, the principal joy for me is the fact that, unlike in Gloomhaven, which again is the appropriate comparison, rather than saying move 4, you have a specific movement template. This isn't like X-Wing where it's simultaneous template selection and you reveal them, but rather it's a question of, for me, an engaging tactical puzzle about how to maneuver and where you're going to go so as to maintain advantage because you desperately want to shoot people from the rear, and how to use your weapon systems. That having been said, I have a specific pointed question for you, Walker. How do you feel the combat system has held up for you after 4, 5, 6 skirmishes?
I think it's slowly getting a little samey, right? Because we're not getting, I think, new weapons fast enough, and I don't think that there's going to be a huge difference of the weapons that we are going to get. But I think the combat is short enough that it really is not too bad.
I agree. The length of the scenarios is good, and again, the length of setup is helpful compared to many, many similar games, not just Gloomhaven. But as a consequence, the scenarios end up feeling more or less the same, right? Well, you don't have much on the board, there's not much to interact with, and you have 2 engine systems and 2 weapon systems, and you just pump those over and over again.
Yeah, but I have to give it to them, right? Because it is a cooperative system, right? Because the more stuff you add, the more impossible it will be to run. And I think because it's completely cooperative, I think this is... they are very much pushing the limits of what a cooperative system can do.
Really?
I really do.
Well, again, the obvious comparison set is Gloomhaven. The amount of things that a character can do, even at level 1 in Gloomhaven, admittedly, level 2 comes a little bit too far off for our preferences. You never feel like you're doing the same turn twice in a row. Whereas in Stars of Akarios, I routinely feel I'm doing the same thing over and over again.
But Gloomhaven is this. You meet up and you start slugging swords. Where Stars of Akarios is, it's very much a ballet in space. The ships are petering all over the place. They do a great job with the AI system. There's a lot more to the maneuvering in Stars of Akarios than there is in Gloomhaven.
Sure, I wouldn't necessarily want, an array of 6 complicated maneuver templates to be available. You're right, that would be a little bit overwhelming. But in terms of this being a ballet in space, I really think you're exaggerating it, because as you pointed out, when the AI ships are far away, they tend to act rather dumb. And that's okay, I've got no problem with that. It's an AI system. I don't mind the fact that the proximate ships will be a threat to you and the distant ships will mostly peter around until you're ready to go chase them down. That's okay. But as a consequence, I really don't feel like any scenario differs from the next. The enemy ship types, although beautiful, if you have the miniatures expansion pack, the ships really, really please me. Again, I'm a sucker for sci-fi. I love me a lot of the classic science fiction setups in games, whether it's Star Control, whether it's Wing Commander, things of that ilk. And I think some of the ship designs are very visually appealing. Not the most unique in the world, but that's fine. But at the end of the day, whether I'm fighting this frigate with a default attack of 4 or this fighter with a default attack of 2, it's just going to go in the corner and maybe approach a little bit inexpertly until we come and swarm them and destroy them.
True. I agree with all of those, but I think if you make it any more complicated, it will really draw out those scenarios. And just because we really enjoy the space combat doesn't mean everyone will, because other players might be the exact opposite. They might really enjoy the planetary exploration and not like the space combat.
Sure. I mean, if you really loved Seventh Continent, if that really turns your crank, if you don't find those things grindingly attritional, that's a common problem that we have in a lot of story-based games. We had the same experience, for what it's worth, of Sleeping Gods, where you're just reading paragraphs and then the game designers are like, well, we need to gamify this somehow, so let's have some sort of endurance system that'll run out and then they have to go back to port or what have you. And ultimately, a lot of that lives or dies by the strength of the world, by the strength of the writing, by the strength of the setting. I would be hard-pressed to imagine many people finding the setting and characters of Stars of Akarios to be particularly gripping. It takes me very little to come up with a headcanon for much of anything. And give me a little bit of personality, a little bit of texture, a little bit of flavor, whether it's the wacky stylings of a Cthulhu Death May Die, or the madcap satire of something like an Assault on Doomrock, or the excellent writing of something like Legacy of Dragonholt. I mean, obviously, I'd just rather the writing to be better, but even beyond that, if the universe were vaguely fleshed out, I might have a sense, but you're given nothing.
It's true. I'm very not attached to anything, not even my ship, because our ships are almost identical.
Yes.
And there is no, like, our characters on the planet do nothing that's different than, each other character. Yeah. So there's no investment like there is in Gloomhaven or any of the other games where you have personal and, you don't want this character to die, or you know exactly how you are different from everybody else.
They've done a lot with very little. It's very impressive. Like, the fact that the combat is engaging as it is, with this relatively narrow universe of stakes, with the relatively samey scenarios, with the relatively samey effects, is very impressive. But it makes me think that this combat system would have been better suited to not a campaign-style game, but instead, perhaps a slightly more modest scenario-based skirmish-type experience, co-op or not. I think of things like Vengeance, Roll and Write, which have very, very clever combat mechanisms. And they're like, okay, how could we frame this in an appropriate manner, rather than necessarily blowing everything up into a campaign? And so I wonder if there's a possible other version of this that doesn't feel saddled to this empty universe of nothingness.
Well, true. Like we said, the first planetary mission, you were forced to do something. And it was, attritional. But the one we had after that, it gave us the option of almost bailing on it immediately, and we could go right back to the space combat. So then at least you have the space combats that are at least connected in some way.
Sure.
So it's all light skirmishing connected in some way, and maybe we can bypass all of the planetary stuff going forward. I'm not sure. We'll see when we're presented with another one. If they gave us a way to escape it and get back to space, we'll see.
So basically, as it stands, as I say, I really like the space combat in theory, and I really enjoyed it in practice for definitely the first 3, 4, 5 sorties. That's not nothing. But is it enough to sustain a campaign through the entirety of the experience? Is it enough to justify a very expensive box with another expensive box of ships to be added onto it? I really don't know. I'm kind of on the fence. We've just finished the prologue, and we haven't really seen the rest of what the game has to offer. Unless there's a radical change that really injects some solid variety, I probably am going to finish the rest of the campaign only to the extent that other people in the campaign are aggressively requesting it, because my enthusiasm is almost entirely gone.
Yeah, it's almost its worst enemy, because as a campaign system, you want to keep at it over and over again, at least play once a week, where it will show the tedium, like how things are the same, right? Whereas if it was,
you're right.
If it was just a, something you pulled out, every 3 weeks or so, then it wouldn't show these flaws so badly.
That's a good point. And to be fair, just for context, there are very few campaign games that we've played lately where it's like, yes, absolutely, back to this. And it was the strength of the ship combat that made us initially want to pursue it. But as you say, I think it's its own worst enemy, and it's kind of in this awkward middle where it wants to leverage its strengths, but at the same time, in order to make it a campaign, it feels like it needs to add on all this other stuff. And honestly, I probably would have been more enthusiastic if I just, as you said, cared about anything that was going on.
Agreed.
So those have been an experience with Stars of Akarios, at least the prologue. More to follow. If you don't hear anything else from us on it, though, we didn't keep it up.
And Stars of Akarios is designed by who?
By Brendan McCaskill and Jonathan Twaits, and published by... from Kelowna.